All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Excess Exceed. This is Gearface. I'm joined today by MadFnorder once again. Mad, thank you so much for being here.
The pleasure.
Really, really excited to learn from you about this guy over here, Carl Swangee, not to be confused with another Carl associated with robots. This is Carl from back in season 2, back in the Seventh Cross days. Uh, Incredibly excited to learn about this guy. One of the coolest characters I think in the game. Um, a couple disclaimers really quick before we get started. As always, number one, we're going to be talking about playing to win on this show. That's kind of weird with Carl because he's rotated out of competitive play. So if you are playing Carl to win, either you're doing sort of a casual competitive thing or you found a legacy tournament, in which case this advice is for you. But playing to win is not the only way to play in Exceed. So if the lines of play that we're describing don't sound fun to you, please play in the way that does sound fun to you because you'll have more fun that way. Carl's a cool character. There's really cool things you can do with him. There's things that feel really fun. So please play him for fun. You'll have fun. Disclaimer number two, even for a character this old, in a meta as enshrined as Season 2's was, Season 2 was in competitive play for a long time. People know a lot about these characters and how they perform and what they do. Even in that context, Exceed's not a solved game. Mad's going to say a lot of things like, always do this or never do this. Um, Take all that with a grain of salt. I am not an expert at all. Mad is an expert, but even his opinion is just an informed one. Um, so if there's a line of play that you don't think is represented here, let us know. There's an excellent chance that you know something that we don't. But yeah, with all that said, Mad, tell me a little bit about Carl.
Carl, because we have two Carls, just like we have two Chaoses here in Exceed Land. Carl Swangee is one of the two promo characters released with Season 2. He was a core part of my tournament team for as long as Season 2 was legal to play. I've had some really great success with him. He has his own unique mechanic that has been I've seen people try to use in some customs, but
Sure.
hasn't resurfaced in sort of mainline Exceed since. And he is very much of a simple on his face, but the nuance of succeeding with him, I think, is difficult. And he is also just a lot of fun because he can produce moments of incredible highs when you catch your opponent flinching. And some really satisfying end games as well. And in general, just ton of fun to play, especially because of his unique ability to bend one of the key rules of Exceed, which didn't actually reappear until was a little bit in Season 2, came back a bit in 6 or 7, and I'll get to that in just a second. But archetype-wise, Carl is very much of a rushdown grappler. A lot of his strengths come at close range. He has two of the scariest range 1 cards in the history of time, and other powerful threats as well. He also likes relying on close range normals to generate threats. So he wants to get in, he wants to stay in. So he will be spending some time chasing his opponents down, but once he gets in, he puts them under an incredible amount of threat. And if you're going to go toe to toe with him, he will win. You will go down first. So let's start with the character card. We can talk about the UA here, which seems really innocuous. Opponent special attack +1 armor. This matters more than you think. And I'd like to pause here and talk about what I think is sort of his second UA. So let's swing over and look at his ultras, specifically
Yeah,
the boost text on these ultras.
we've got Overload to talk about.
Yeah, so Overload is Carl's unique mechanic. And the way these work is when you set a normal from hand, you may set one of these ultras alongside it. Ordinarily, when you make an EX attack, gaining +1 power, speed, armor, and guard, you need to set 2 copies of the same card. For
Yep.
Carl, he can set 1 normal and 1 of his ultras. the copy of the Ultra will be discarded, and the attack becomes EX. There were characters who could get EX attacks in Season 2 through mechanics. Merciless could generate it with her ability.
Minato had something like that, right?
Yeah, but in general, they didn't. The ability to sort of pull them out of your pocket was, again, with the surprise factor of it. What
right.
kind of an EX is it? You don't know.
So, and we could. I mean, I think you're going here in a second here, but speaking of Season 6 and Season 7, you've got Superior, you've got Badass, where you put a boost down and you say, this is an EX attack, and I play my sweep at range 1 and I bust up the opponent's sweep or something. This is something that I can do on defense with no setup at all. I can say we're at range 3, EX assault. Hold that.
And the real trick of it is I can say EX assault, and then it's 2 turns can go down, and I can say EX assault again.
Right. So because I have 2 copies of each of these cards and 2 copies of any given normal. So I can throw more EXs and more flexible EXs than basically any other character in the game.
Right. You can't cut off his options as easily, especially in sort of the mid-deck area, because you can say, oh, an assault is down, they said an EX. Against any other character, EX assault is no longer an option.
Right,
I'm sure everyone's experienced that moment. Experience where I had that moment where somebody is, 15 cards into their deck, 20 cards into their deck, they said an EX, and it's obvious. It's one of 2 things, and one of them doesn't even hit. So you know what you're dealing with.
And the strength of EX attacks sometimes is that you don't have to, like, you can know and still not be able to stop it. Like, these allow you to break all sorts of rules in fun ways when you EX them. So sometimes that's fine for that person, but Carl won't be in that situation very often.
Yeah, to sort of round the whole thing out, basically, the advantage of an EX is super strong. Plus stats, your on curve is above curve, you can threaten things, you can win the strike. The disadvantages are information exhaustion, option exhaustion, and losing the other half of the card. If you want to be cheeky and open with EX dive, your opponent knows I have 25 cards that aren't tech.
Yep, and here's our good old training dummy over here in case we need to talk about board states in Ryu. If you do that against Ryu, he's like, awesome, I probably just won the game. Because I have so many awesome boosts that I can play that you should be teching. If you do that against me, that's a serious problem for you. Carl can do that. Carl can say EX dive against Ryu and still have a tech online.
And this is that last thing where I want to point back to that front side UA. When you EX, you get 1 armor and 1 guard. Right. And not a lot of attacks do too. There were a number of reversal style, like 1 range 1, speed 7, power 2 poke attacks in Season 2. Yep. But generally you're thinking about grasp, 173. But
sure,
sometimes just getting that 1 extra piece of armor can turn a stun out of one. Especially when you're dealing with an EX.
So every EX tech has 2 effective guard all on its own. If your opponent is if your opponent is striking with a special attack into you, now you have 3 effective guard, 2 of its armor. That can matter.
It can.
There's a lot. To your point, there's a lot of 3 power attacks in Exceed.
Right, and I think it matters more when talking about Carl's endgame, and we'll loop back around to that. But let's take a brief moment and also go ahead and flip Carl over and see how this overload thing goes from this is pretty good to
no.
Oh yes. +2 power on normals. Now we already know +2 is a magic number in terms of breakpoints.
Right.
Things that ordinarily would you'd survive, you don't. Things that ordinarily would their guard would hold, not anymore.
Right.
add +1 more from EX on top of that. Let's have a brief moment of sort of the peak. And you have to remember, Carl is again playing into a set which has two common shapes you'll see later in Exceed, colloquially known as whirls and eyes. Let me see if I can grab one of those each real quick.
Yeah, you grab an eye. I'll grab a whirl from a later season.
Sure. I'm gonna ghost to 2 because I know where it is.
Yeah.
Actually, no, I know where a later one is. It's in Rachel's kit here.
I'm actually pulling the whirl from Rachel right now. I'm beating you to it.
So I need an
There's
eye.
Whirlwind.
Well, I'll go to the classic.
So while Mad's looking, so the shapes we're talking about, the eye especially is not in quite as heavy rotation anymore. There he is. There's our boy. So a whirl is a above curve range 3 option. So it's a 6-speed range 3 option. Often has some, like, really good ones have some kind of push effect on them. But a whirl is it's like a DP but at range 3. And eye is a 1 to 3 attack with 7 speed, but very low power, and usually some way to shore up that power.
Yeah, they're both intended as quick poke outs that are extremely powerful on defense against anything fast.
Yeah.
So with knowing these attacks are all over in season 2, let's savor the moment where you are playing Carl, you're exceeded, you're sitting at range 3, and you play Overloaded Assault.
Yep.
We have a stat line of, range 1 before close 2, so range 1 to 3, speed 6. You've got 1 armor, 1 guard, 2
7
armor,
power.
7 power.
Yep.
I would love to trade into Assault with 7 power. That sounds great to me.
It's like so that without setup, without a boost, without any sort of nothing but resource expenditure on your side of an ultra and an assault, you cleanly beat sweep at range 3, and also you cleanly muscle through a whirlwind or an eye most of the time.
And even more so, there's nothing that says that assault isn't going to be followed with another assault at range 1.
Sure.
Because you only spent 1 of your 2.
Yep.
And that's where he is a stat monster, but using overload and crafting your game around these moments where you get to, and I will say, there is nothing that stops you from playing a traditional EX. Sometimes that's exactly what you need at the time, but in a world where information control is important and hand contents are important, because one of Carl's weaknesses is his economy, and it is notable for folks coming from Guilty Gear the Board Game Season 7. These are sets with reading, and they're very centered around controlling your hand so somebody doesn't get to play reading on you,
right,
and get a big cash out against you. That's being able to go surprise and then 5 minutes later go surprise again. It gets a lot of mileage.
Right.
So we've talked about, this is the base of the character. What's his game plan? In the early game, the games where I win with Carl and do not exceed are rare.
Okay.
Because even if I'm ahead, turning over isn't just because I need to catch up on damage or deal more damage. It's to create those moments where my opponent's options become invalid. Like I said, when I play EX Assault and I'm exceeded, sweep is no longer safe. I'm not trading with sweep, I'm blowing it up.
You're beating it clean for 7, right? And like you beat sweep clean with cross for 3. Blowing sweep up or spike for 5, like, and you gain advantage on top of it. That is a crushing win for you if you can pull that off.
And you can have sequences where your opponent tries to attack you, you cross out, and you follow up with the EX exceeded dive. That's 8.
Yeah, that beats focus. Like you can on or above curve with no resource, or I'm sorry, with no boosts in play, stun the 2 like hallmark defensive cards in Exceed.
Right.
That's
And
crazy.
and that is, I think, what his end game centers around, is getting to a point where you can land 2 to 3 really potent strikes and your opponent is done. Like, they're just gone.
Right.
So you're in the first half of the game, your UA is primarily for taking basically giving you a little extra life. If you think about how many specials your opponent plays over the course of the game, you might as well change the UA to say you have 34 starting life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Give or take. If they have ignore armor, you got less. But yeah, probably over the course of the first half of the game, it'll be, call it 50-50 between normals and specials.
And I will say, for the first time that you do all the math and you think everything is perfect, this UA only applies to specials. Ultras are not specials.
Yep.
And the first time that bites you, you will feel very silly. But
Right.
there are times where you can say, oh, this is a 2-power reversal. I can deal with that. I have with that extra little buffer of armor. But in general, you're negating some of the chip damage you're taking, and you're trying to build your way toward your Exceed mode while still maintaining a decent board state and a decent amount of resources.
So this isn't really about subverting an interaction or increasing your trading potential where you wouldn't otherwise be able to trade. You're not Anji or even like Vincent, right? Like, you are using this to basically ignore some damage.
Yeah, there are opportunities where this, like I said, you could say, okay, this works. Again, going back to that, like, this works unless my opponent plays this poke, but that one little piece of armor will cover that situation.
Right.
In general, you're more concerned about it making the delta on your trades just a little bit better.
Right. Okay. And I'm noticing here this effect is ridiculous, but this is a 4-gauge Exceed cost. So this early game state where you are relying on this to increase your deltas and try to survive is going to be longer than I might be comfortable with.
Yeah, and this is on a character with no gauge generation, no gauge cheats.
Right.
And some pretty committal options. He does have some lighter ones, but in general, you don't want to be trading too far down. And again, this is something to reflect on into season 2. Trading into a character with transforms, if you play something somewhat obvious, you're giving them a chance to gain access to permanent power.
Right.
So,
and their end game, as scary as this is, we've got our boy Zolt over here.
mm-hmm.
I really don't want to give him his end game. I really don't want to give Renea her end game. Like that, there's some scary late game characters in Carl's meta.
Right. And even looking into like season 3 and a bit in season 4, giving some Street Fighter characters their Exceed or giving them reliable crits that they can use against you.
Right.
All of a sudden your options are looking competitive, but not necessarily winning.
Right. And for how hard you're going to be working to get this, you want it to be game breakingly strong, not competitive with what your opponent is doing for cheaper and with more ease.
Right. And this is one of the things where and I can feel D cringing somewhere on the internet right now. I think Carl is an okay wild swinger, and it definitely helps with his economic issues, but it doesn't let him I feel like to win the game, you're going to have to win from hand, because the real power of overload can't come from a wild swing. And that's the big difference compared to badass and superior.
Sure.
I can play badass, cancel it, and say something's going to work, and flip the top card of my deck, and it's EX.
Right.
But in order to get that effect from Carl, and Carl also has moments where I know my normals are great, but do I have the right normal?
Right. And you can't traditionally traditionally EX or even overload EX from a wild swing. That's not how the game works. You need something else, and Carl doesn't have that.
Yeah. like I said, characters like Remilus, they can EX their wild swings using the boosts from season 6 and 7. But for Carl to make those offensive moves, he's got to play them from hand. Now,
Right.
to his benefit, he has some incredibly terrifying mix-up tools. And let's kick over to those specials and talk about that. That reinforce the fact that once he catches you, he is in the position he wants to be, and that
Right.
is squarely at range 1.
Right.
So,
and so for the next few minutes when we're talking about these specials, also just for as a note for viewers at home, you can start ignoring overload for a second because these boosts only apply to normals.
yes, thank you.
This effect only applies to normals. So unless one of the mix-up options that this enables is with an EX attack, like a defensive EX attack, we can come back to that in a second.
So I'm actually going to start at the end and talk about the not range 1 normal, or not range 1 special, which is yep, improvised weapon, aka coffee, aka surprise. It's an interesting shape. It is the fastest of fast fireballs, range 3 to 6, power 1, speed 6. This is hilarious in the Carl mirror, where it doesn't even do anything. For the rare situations where that happens. And a somewhat interesting hit effect where it says hit. If the opponent initiated the strike, you return this card to your hand, which means you don't get gauge. Otherwise, gain advantage.
Right.
So if you suspect your opponent is trying to do some sort of a quick check on you, or you could even play this against an incoming assault if you are concerned about it. You can just quickly jab them out of their motion. Playing this on offense, it's great from starting positions. I play this card from hand. You take a damage, you probably wild swing or spend a card, and I got a gauge, and now we go again.
Right.
And then every once in a while, your opponent will have an answer or a slow fireball, or they will commit to the EX dive and absolutely kick you in the face.
Right.
So it is not perfectly reliable, but it's a good tool to have when your opponent has a specific kind of potent range threat that you want to at least have some kind of an answer to. Maybe like it doesn't work against a critical Ryu Hadoken, but against a Ken Hadoken, which would be a lot of damage coming in, you can always
you can stuff that out. And
yeah,
the hit effect, I'm sorry to interrupt, the hit effect is not a May.
yes.
If I am doing this on defense, I get it back. That's great. But I'm not getting gauge, period. I'm not gaining advantage. That probably doesn't matter, but I'm not getting gauge, period. I can't choose.
Right. And that's the big weakness, because again, we're desperately clawing our way toward that exceed side where we can really, really start to put the pressure on our opponents.
Right.
So it is something that has a pretty high rate of success, but its loss cases really hurt.
Right.
And so it's something to use kind of sparingly. Let's keep moving over here to disarming strike.
Before we do, Mad, really quickly,
we'll talk about the boost.
A couple things that you no, I actually just had a question about the attack shape. A couple things that you mentioned here, like, all right, this loses to assault, or you can use this to stuff an assault, but it loses really hard to EX dive, stuff like that. Both the ones that you described are advancing options. Carl's really scary at range 1. Is he so scary at range 1 that I should be assuming that my opponent doesn't want to be there? Like am I Zangief, basically? Will they ever assault or dive into me?
I think Zangief is willing to have this fight, and I think Zangief doesn't always win it. But for the most part, I think, and this is what I mean by saying that the lose case on this card is a lot worse. Yeah, say my opponent initiates, or here's a better example. I throw this out, my opponent initiates with or counters with an EX assault.
Right.
I plink them for 0.
Right.
They come in, they hit me for 5, and take advantage back.
Right.
They probably weren't using those assaults anyway. Maybe they wanted to save one right now to backstep, but season 2 was also a season with a lot of mobility options.
Right.
Yes, they're at range 1, but they have the turn.
They have advantage. Okay, I get you. So people will go into range 1, but they're not planning to stay there against
Right.
Carl. So in addition to our, and this is very grappler life, right?
Mhm.
In addition to our building gauge and clawing for every resource we can get to maintain our engine to get to exceed mode, when you're talking about that, you're also talking about positioning and getting yourself into a position to do all those things. That's also probably going to be kind of hard.
Right. And some of Carl's cards are just that much better on offense than defense. We're gonna get to that at least 2 cards down the line, definitely. But especially for the average kind of season 2 character, for me to close in, deal a bunch of damage, I can do something like boost light and stare you in the face. Because
Right.
as much as Carl either has to bet on EX grasp to like catch a cross, or probably counter boost or eat it on the chin. Like when Carl's pressure, Carl's cards are better at range 1 by a lot. But one of the things that I feel very strongly about with Carl, which his boosts actually do aid a little bit, is he wants to keep striking. He wants his opponent to be on low hand. He wants to call out his one opponent's defensive plan and then crush the rest.
Okay.
And beating an opponent into a corner and kind of striking at them back to back, and they don't know when the big hammers in his kit are going to come. Especially if they have to deal with like multiple EXs that are even bigger threats.
Right.
Yeah, there will be a point where you're staring at your opponent. You have one card and they have one card, but your one card's going to be a lot better than theirs.
Okay. And you are fighting to get to that point all game, because as we've established, if you successfully actually flip as Carl and get your opponent into that state, the game is not going to last for very long.
Right.
Okay, so my job is Carl, get a bunch of gauge, get my exceed mode online, and actually get to a point where I can threaten these scary things while my opponent tries to stop me.
And I'm going to say that his specials are generally good enough that they compete with his EX for aggression space. Like these are all really great cards.
Okay.
The worst of them still has a ton of numbers on it for no reason, and I still think is a fine card. It's just that he tends to want the boost more.
Okay.
So to give a perfect example, let's keep moving.
Yeah, please continue.
Disarming strike. Because what does a close range aggressive grappler need but an above curve assault on a special?
Above curve jump in.
Yeah. So 1/2, speed 6. That 2 means has some trouble with quick EXs. An EX cross will get you out of jail, but hit, get card advantage is what this says.
Right.
Your opponent must discard a normal or reveal a hand with none. Every card you knock out of your opponent's hands, this isn't, no, it doesn't give you an advantage, but you got in. You can duck in under certain attacks. This is good enough that you want to play it, and not so good that you feel bad if you EX it also.
Okay.
And it gets you to exactly the range you want to be in. It knocks a card out of your opponent's hand, which is sort of like half an advantage. And it's one more threat. It's also the single card threat you play where you can say to your opponent, was I above curve anyway? Just keep worrying about it.
Oh, so this is also cover for EX assault, where I'm saying we're at range 3. I play one card and they're like, well, they're not coming in at speed 6 at least. Oh, well, darn.
They are.
They are actually. Maybe that roll wasn't such a good idea then.
It's also cover for 7 power exceed mode spike.
Yeah. Yeah, it would be that, wouldn't it? And 7 power exceed mode spike seems like something that you want to have a way to confirm. That's terrifying.
Yeah.
Is this also a good defensive option? Above curve at range 3 kind of works like an EX assault, but you don't have to worry about losing the opportunity to gain advantage?
I'm gonna contrast it with uh coffee in this, in that I say you could hold on to it, but against the options that uh so
Oh, sure. If your opponent doesn't have a whirl, and whirls are all over the place in season 2, this is probably better on defense. But if they're uh, if you're in the metagame that Carl was in, that might actually not be
mhm.
the best idea.
I think that using it as a defensive response is situational. It depends on the opponent. The biggest thing this will do is you can initiate with it and catch a cross, but you don't have that benefit on offense.
On defense, right? Okay,
Yes, and so losing the close and losing the movement is, in my mind, a little bit worse than play improvised weapon, poke something out, and if it didn't, you gain advantage when you initiate.
right.
Um, so I think the loss case is a little worse, and the defensive application is a little worse.
Okay,
So again, it still absolutely does the job, but this also feels a lot worse when your opponent strikes and you have to do that fast, slow contemplation, and you just run this into a sweep.
sure. Because I mean, you could do that with improvised weapon at its closest range, but there's plenty of opportunities to hit improvised weapon at 4 or 5 or something.
Right.
This doesn't really
Um,
have that luxury.
yeah, and this, while it is fast, it doesn't cover ranges that Carl isn't comfortable already fighting at.
Oh, sure. Good point. Okay, so this doesn't really have quite as much. It's not as big a niche to fill.
Right.
Gotcha.
Carl already doesn't want to be at range 5.
Right.
Um, and I will say this also does occasionally have some great use at ducking in under a projectile. Like if you are at 5 and they throw something they think is guaranteed, this might be enough speed to get you past a faster, like a speed 5 projectile, and get
Sure.
you into its range shadow.
Yeah. With
Probably
sort
a
of
better defensive use of it.
more narrow range bands where your opponent is hoping to catch you with speed or something. You do have something that's fast enough to get in from to get from 4 to 2 or something like that.
Right. If somebody, if going back to, again, doesn't work great with Ryu, but going to the Ken example, if they
Sure.
played EX Hadoken at you,
Sure.
um, EX crit Hadoken, you do not want to eat that.
Right. And
It's
improvised weapon isn't going to stop it.
right, but because again, you've got that EX armor, but this will duck in under it if you're at
Right.
the appropriate range.
Right. Okay. That makes sense.
But again, the big thing is it gets you in, it strips a card, or can it? I'd be hard pressed to say whether stripping a card and hoping you hit a defensive card, or seeing your opponent's hand and knowing exactly what you have to play with is better. They're both great.
Right. Oh, and that actually, so if they don't have a normal in hand, doing that on defense seems quite strong because then you can unreactably reading them. Um,
Well,
Normally when you get
no,
hand
because they would
information.
strip the last normal if they
Oh,
they wouldn't be able to
right,
reading
right, right,
Ubble.
right. They wouldn't have a normal to read. Gotcha. But
Right.
having hand information going into your turn is still valuable. Having hand information when your opponent is about to strike into you is still incredibly strong.
Right, especially when let's go to the next card and we'll see why having hand information on your opponent is incredibly strong.
Right.
Swangee Elbow is it became a card type of its own. Elbows is actually a term for this kind of command grab-esque shape.
Right.
That kind of went down the line to other seasons, but this is the granddaddy of them all, and my goodness, is this card great. This card is, I would say, maybe not his most important card, but is his defining card.
Okay.
Um, I often say in my mind one of the biggest difference between a true Exceed grappler and not is having a powerful range 1 sort of mix up breaking option.
Okay.
Everyone thinks range 1, I'm safe. Range 1, I can't be spiked. My block works, my focus works. Unless my opponent stacks up an enormous amount of scary things on the other end, range 1 is also where speed doesn't matter. We're
Right.
both gonna slug it out with each other.
The things that really benefit from speed are things that you would play at range like 3, like dive and spike, to cleanly win a strike.
Exactly. So having this kind of a tool where it's speed, middle speed that absolutely wins out against everything lower than it is this kind of signature grappler moment. And other grapplers do have this card shape. Zangief has it. But there's another piece I want to note about it is surprisingly, it has having 4 guard on it doesn't seem like it matters. I promise you it does.
Yeah, so I was actually about to ask about that because, sorry. So among the normals, if you're at range 1, the things that your opponent could feasibly be playing that could beat this card, uh, Spike. I'm sorry, not Spike. Cross and Grasp both still beat it even with that guard by getting out of the way of it. So where is that 4 guard coming in?
So where it matters is, like I said, a bit into season 2's meta, where there were non-reversal pokes that would have lower middling power or low power and have boosts or transforms behind them, but didn't have the movement effects on Grasp and Cross.
Okay, so and there are still plenty of those in I mean Millie is probably a bad example. She's got too much movement, but actually yeah,
No, Millie is the perfect example.
Yeah, Millie's a perfect example because she wouldn't stun you, right?
Right. You low kick this and Carl takes 1 and hits her right back.
So there are plenty of shapes like this in Exceed where Grasp might beat Swangy Elbow, but just a fast poke isn't going to, or a DP isn't going to.
Right. And 4 is a lot. 4 means we're beating Ryu Shoryuken. Yeah. 4 means we're beating Assault. We're beating light boosted Assault. And when I say beating, obviously we're trading right back, but being able to diffuse a setup or cash out on a setup of your own, you think this is bad, put light behind it.
Oh yeah.
+2 speed.
I hope you have Grasp, basically.
And also because of Carl's tendency to advance constantly toward his opponent, he will more likely than not end up in the position where his opponent is the one who's cornered.
Right.
And this gets even better at that point. Being able to still keep a guaranteed chunk of damage plus absolutely destroy everything slower than it, I think it matters a lot. I think it makes this card amazing. I would much rather have its 4 guard than the 1 power that Zangief has on it.
Right.
But yeah, this is why when you get to range 1, your opponent starts to sweat because you have a mid speed that beats every mid speed. It beats every slow. And yeah, it's reliable. It works. The payout is decent. The threat of it is immense, and you can hide card after card behind the threat of, is this the elbow?
Right. Because eventually they're going to play focus. They're going to blink, and that's when you hit them with the elbow. But before that, you're like, cool, range 1 assault. I don't know. You're not playing a slow into it. Or rather, you're not playing a slow when I have Swangy Elbow up. Armor guard assault, something like that. Just sweep them at range 1. They're not diving over you. You have a 4 speed attack, so you can check a lot of things with this.
It checks a lot of things. It pays out against a lot of things, and it just works. And you get something I've talked about in other Exceed videos is the real power of mix-up characters is through mind games generating extra copies of their good cards. By representing Elbow, you make your other cards that much stronger. If I represent Elbow to make you flinch and sneak in an Exceed mode normal, like my payout is enormous and I still have the Elbow.
Right. And I already got value out of it. The elbow could be at the bottom of my deck. But because you're afraid of it, it still helped me win that strike.
Exactly. Okay. And this is so, again, I think it's his defining card, if not his most powerful or important one.
Okay. And we haven't talked about boosts yet, and I'm sure we'll get to them in a moment. But I assume that means let's pretend that Armor Up is the greatest boost of all time. Still probably spend 1 copy for Armor Up. Keep keep Swangee Elbow a live threat in your opponent's mind as long as you possibly can.
Right. And to some extent, that is a little matchup dependent. If you're playing a game against a true, dedicated, evasive, unlimited force kind of zoner who can just run from side to side, there are times where your times at range 1 are going to be rare enough that you'll just pummel them anyway. Like
you
in a
kind of
character,
you kind of got to shoot your shot.
right?
Okay.
And 3 armor as a boost, even at 1 force, pretty darn good.
Right.
But we'll swing back and kind of
Yeah.
review over the boosts.
Let's get into the boost. But for the purposes of Swangee Elbow, my point is like I almost don't care how good the boost is. For most matchups, I'm trying to maintain the threat of this card. So like boosting 1 copy might be fine, but boosting 2 is probably a scary idea because I need my opponent afraid of this.
Right.
Okay, gotcha.
And it gets even worse again. 2 cards away, but we'll talk about again what I think is his worst special, and it's not a bad card.
Okay. Oh, that's a lot of 3s though.
1 to 3, power 3, speed 3, armor 3, guard 3. And one of the weirdest riders in Exceed. I don't think this has ever been reprinted.
Yeah, I've never seen this before.
So it's templated oddly. The intent of this effect is basically if an effect such as sweep would hit you, you reduce the cards you would lose by 1 to 0 potentially. So if this card is played and your opponent plays sweep, you don't discard.
How would it work if it doesn't specify a card number? Like your opponent must discard their hand. Is it hand -1 or is it your whole hand?
I honestly don't know.
I'll go ask some of our rules lawyers in Discord after this. I'll put it in the written guide. That's an interesting question.
I personally, if you put an elbow to my head and asked me to answer it right now, I would say that it is you would discard 1 less. Your hand is a known value of cards.
Okay.
So you discard all but 1 card.
Okay, I'm down with that interpretation, especially if I'm Carl Swangee, because then I get to keep a card. So I'm cool with that. My opponent might not be. Yeah, I'll figure that out and I'll add it in later. But regardless, this is a very rare effect. This is not something that most characters have. How valuable is it?
Not very, because the most common source of that kind of effect is sweep, and this card is more of the closest relative to this card in more modern Exceed is Sagat's Tiger Uppercut.
Yeah.
There are a few other cards. There's some ultras in Season 7. Axel has an ultra that looks like this. That'll basically have these kind of low to mid speed, high armor. Eno has an ultra also like that.
Yep.
And then lose the armor.
Right.
Yeah. And that's the thing is playing this into sweep is sort of like it's a consolation prize.
Oh yeah, you just hit them you just grasped them without movement. You hit them for 3, and then lost your 3 armor, and then they hit you for 6, but didn't discard a card.
Right, and you got to draw 1.
Right. Okay.
So this is a stable defensive option. It's great when your opponent is somewhat cornered, and I'm threatening all these other terrifying range 1 cards. I can mix this in there as part of my relentless, you better believe the word coming out of my mouth on every turn is strike.
Right. And okay, so this is a great situation where that grasp that was going to check Swangee Elbow does 0 damage into my 3 armor, and I trade up, and I'm still scary.
Right.
Okay.
And it's like I said, it is stable. You're way more likely to be using this for the boost than you are for the attack, but it's not a bad card to play. It's not a bad card to play when you're committed to losing the strike. Like you know what's coming. It's that critical Ryu fireball, and you don't have the ability to duck under it.
Sure. Just take less damage and draw a card.
Right. So that situation's also kind of rough because you kind of would rather eat it and then boost its next turn. But
right.
The point remains, it can be used to lose less.
Right.
But this card is never going to win more.
Right. So I'm sorry. Go ahead. Finish your thought.
No.
Oh,
go ahead.
I was going to say so at range 1 to range 3, this is kind of filler offense. where I'm like, or even filler defense, where I'm like, I don't really care about the outcome of this strike, but in the context of its boost, I had better be pretty sure. Spoiler warning: the boost is a movement tool. I had better be pretty sure that the game is going to remain at range 1 for the duration of the fight here, so that I won't need this boost for later. Before I throw that out as just filler.
Yeah, that or my opponent's cornered, and we're already edging toward the situation where
I'm already exceeded. This is going to be like a 3-strike game at this point. This could be a card.
Right.
Okay.
So, speaking of being scary at range 1, one of the other things that I think is signature for a grappler in Exceed is having another focus. And but what I mean by that doesn't necessarily need to be a slow defensive card, but another card that prevents you from being moved.
Okay.
Because if you can get to establish your range, and you're more likely to hold that range than other characters against Grasp, which is the most common fast defensive option, it establishes your ability to hold that favored range and make your opponent think before sort of reflexively playing certain defensive options. And this card has numbers on it.
Yeah.
Yeah, range 1 to 2, power 7. Just soak that in.
That's already on a special for free. That's already ridiculous.
Speed 2, 2 armor, 3 guard. Opponents cannot move you. And then a very interesting after. Not only does it have lose all armor, if you did not hit the opponent, you take 3 damage.
Okay.
Hilariously, this is before we started specifying that damage like this was non-lethal, so you can blow yourself up with it.
You can just die from this.
But this card is great, but I also think it's even better. It's slightly even better on offense, which is weird because like after lose all armor,
Right.
7 power breaks everything down the line.
Yeah, stun sweep natively. Then they're not hitting you back because you're winning the speed tie at speed 2.
Right. And this has a ton of early game value in that you get to range 1 and you have now 2 different options that both say maybe don't play sweep.
Right.
But this also says don't play grasp.
Right. And that can check Swangee elbow. So you have multiple sides to your mix up here.
Right. And obviously this card hates if you play dive or cross. If you jump out of it, that sucks.
Right.
It is worth noting that if someone plays an absolute blowout of a card and they stun you, obviously we're not seeing that after effect, so the problem solves itself.
Right, and you're taking 2 less damage.
Right. But the ability to play this on offense, and I'm sure if anyone's played a bunch of, say, Season 7, one of the most painful experiences is when you're fighting Happy Chaos, and you play sweep, and they play sweep, and they've got an ability to steal an ultra, get 1 more power,
right,
and gain advantage. So their sweep beats your sweep.
Yep.
In this way, being able to beat their slow defensive option cleanly, that's a huge reversal of fortune.
Oh yeah, and you're not even worried. You're not even talking about the ignore armor, ignore guard riders. You're just going to beat it through damage. So this is huge upside if you can hit it. It doesn't seem that hard to hit.
It does. Do take note. This loses to sweep on defense.
Yeah, you lose that speed tie and it stuns you. So this is definitely a better initiated option. It looks like.
But this is one of the other key parts of that terrifying range 1 mix-up, and it's why you want as an objective to encourage your opponent to corner themselves and to cross out and to use those options.
Right, because we've had ways that deal with with grasp, with cease and desist and power short. We have not found a way to deal with cross yet. So you got to get him cornered.
You know what our option, honestly, to deal with cross is?
Grasp.
It's grasp, overload cross of our own.
Sure.
Or we've got a speed 6 special option.
Oh,
just
sure.
because we're not using the movement doesn't mean we don't have
initiate at range 1. Sure, that makes sense. Okay, so we have ways to respond to almost everything, or ways to check their responses as long as we're initiating with almost anything we do. I also noticed, speaking of ranged options, power short does hit at range 2. And we've been talking about, and actually same with Cease and Desist, we've been talking about both those cards in the context of a range 1 mix-up with Swangee Elbow, because the threat of Swangee Elbow makes them much scarier. Is there use for them outside of that range 1 situation, or would you rather just save them for when you're in the perfect position?
My impulse is, if I am at range 2, for me to initiate with Power Short is risky. Because I'm now losing to cheeky spikes. If my
Sure.
opponent's not cornered, I'm losing cross. Like the idea of cross is even more incepted in my opponent's mind to play this at
It,
range 2.
it defending on curve is way less risky than defending below curve. That's fair. So
And it feels a lot less safe, especially because the movement negating effect of it, you're going to see a lot more often from breasts at range 1.
Right. Cross doesn't do anything to move you; it moves them. So the thing that this shuts out is really not a threat at range 2 most of the time.
Right.
Okay, I got you. That makes sense.
Yeah, and of course there are twists and twists on this formula when your opponent can generate extra range, or they have a uniquely shaped special with a push or a before push. Those can all be very important. But as a general idea, you want this in the same way you want Swangee Live to shut off everything slower. This threatening to shut off Grasp and Sweep,
Right.
and in the same card is terrifying.
Right. Okay.
So
These are our two the two scariest parts of our special kit in terms of offensive mix-up. But also we have all of these EX normals and just haymaker normals in Exceed mode that they have to contend with as well.
Right.
Okay.
Do you want to talk about the ultras or swing back on the boosts? Because weirdly, we've already covered the ultra boosts.
Yeah, the ultra boosts are, and we might revisit them a little bit near the end when we talk about the normals in general. But yeah, let's move right to the ultras and then cover boosts real fast, I think.
Sure. So these are both great attacks. These are both fantastic attacks. Carl's economy is terrible.
Right.
And a lot of the times, I mean, you can kind of compare Overload a little bit to its Season 2 neighbor, which is Remiliss's front side ability to spend 3 force and make your attack EX.
Right.
Arguably, she has the bargain. Because her economy is a lot better.
Her economy is better. That's how bad he's spending 2 force to make something an EX attack.
2 force in a specific package to make something EX.
Right. And he's still got the worst end of the deal.
It's Carl again has no natural reload. And like I said, I want to get my ideal situation with Carl is I start with cards comparable to my opponent, and I just play strike after strike until they don't have any left.
Right.
Because these are all terrifying. I talked about how bad these cards are as initiated. How bad are they when your opponent felt forced to wild swing? When they know some of their options are bad. But because of that, and because the economy is so poor, these incredibly good ultras are difficult to use. Because you're not just burning an ultra and the gauge for it, you're also burning an overload.
Right. And every part of that is an important consideration. You don't have force to spend, and the 2 force is 2 force for a grappler. You probably don't have gauge to afford, and also overload is ridiculously strong. So every part of this card is working against the attack here.
So what could possibly be worth it? 110.6 is pretty worth it.
Yeah, that's pretty good, Mad. I don't know. That's a lot of number.
It is a lot of number. There are universes where you'll play this. There are universes where this is what wins you the game. You're just that far ahead by playing this. I've played EX this. It was one of the greatest moments I've had to enjoy.
Take 7 take on curve 11 damage at range 1.
Yeah.
Hold that. That's fun.
I immediately reshuffled afterward, but
yep, makes sense. So in that circumstance where you're playing this though, Mad, at this point I assume you've built up 8 gauge. You've exceeded already. You've built up another 4 gauge after that, or has the game, like, it seems like because you're gunning for your exceed mode so hard, most of the time your game is not going to last long enough after that to get another 4 gauge on top of it. So did you do this instead of exceeding?
This is almost certainly going to end up coming out before you exceed.
Okay.
If it comes out at all, it's going to come out before you exceed. It's usually there was a big back and forth series of exchanges. You're playing somebody who likes to brawl just as much, like against a Ragna, who just wants to keep throwing attacks and has better economy than you. And you found yourself up on gauge in an awkward position, and you want to just say, "I win. I want to swing this by 15 life, and I want to do it right now."
Right.
And I think there's nothing wrong with doing that in that situation, because against those characters who want to exert pressure just as much, no one thinks you will play this card. This is the reverse of a mix-up character. No one in the world thinks you're going to play this card. It's too expensive. It costs you too much. You spent an overload on it. Who in their right mind would play this except to end the game?
And to clarify, all of those things are true. Like everything that they're saying, who would play this? It's too expensive. It costs you an overload. Those are all factors. You should be really careful before you do this. But also, it means they're not expecting it.
Right. And if I can, like I said, if my opponent, especially if they've invested multiple boosts into a strike that they're certain is going to work, man, this does feel good to land. But if I do this, the economy cost is dramatic.
Right. And you kind of need a new game plan now because you're not exceeding anymore.
I mean, there are universes where you will get 8 gauge with this character. But they're rare.
You start the game with 2 blocks, 2 coffee cups. Like
you hit with like a coffee and a cease and desist and a disarming strike, and you flipped early, and they spent a huge time running from you. Right. And you may have gotten a few like chip trades in. You landed a grasp into their focus and traded equally. There are games where you will be threatening this card and just walking toward your opponent and being like, "Try me, please try me."
Right.
Speaking of diffusing boost setups, let's take a look at the other card. This is a lot more reasonable to play, and this is also fantastic.
2 gauge, very, very playable.
Yeah, 1 to 3, power 6, respectable, speed 1. Normals do not hit you. Well, that's great.
That's some text, Mad.
Yeah, it's pretty good. And again, still, this is as good as this is, it's still hard to play.
Right.
But in season 2, you would see especially a lot of stat heavy boost setups. You'd also see that in season 3. Someone is you're playing something like a Chun-Li, where I've got 2 power, 2 speed, or 3 power, 2 speed, hit gain advantage, and I'm 4 spaces away from you, and I've got +4 range.
Right.
This is miserable. How do you deal with this? And being able to say, like, a lot of times, even if you have a known reading, like you've got the hand information to say, I can play focus, I'm going to play reading. I'm going to name a normal attack, my opponent will strike with it.
Right.
There are times against these stat heavy setups where you may have the knowledge, but actually still lose to it anyway. I made my opponent play sweep, I still died.
Right, yeah. Okay, awesome. I'll dive over their sweep. Oh, they played Swift Destruction beforehand. They have +4 speed. I can't beat this. Yes, you can.
Right.
Okay.
Now you can. And ideally, you'll do it while trading up. But this is an emergency button.
Okay.
You can play it if you've got a really solid read. If you can play it if you really feel like you've got your opponent in a situation where their next play is transparent, whether they know it or not.
Right.
Or you can play it off a reading. And in both of those situations, especially if you can turn it into a hit, this is a huge win. Because you've diffused your opponent's setup, you've gotten 6 points of life up on them, and they got nothing.
Right. But otherwise, if they happen to play basically literally any special, 1 speed with no defenses is you're not hitting this, you're not getting value out of it, you're just losing 2 gauge. So you do need to confirm this somehow.
Now, you'd have 1 armor if they played a special.
Oh, excellent point. I hope. Okay, a perfect counter to Bang style Shuriken. We found one.
It
Uh,
beats it every time, except for
every
the
single
times where you
time,
boost power.
unless they put power on it. It's a good thing I got the EX version on deck. I'm ready to go.
Uh,
Yeah, so don't do anything that we just said. Use this as a get out of jail when you not a get out of jail free button, a get out of jail expensive button. This is 2 gauge and you can't afford it.
right. This when you're so because of again, this is influenced more of season 2, but to some extent to season 3. A lot of end game, the bottom of people's decks is going to focus on what information you now have about their options.
Sure.
And this is true in every season of Exceed, but it was especially true in season 2, where there was I felt like there was a lot more setup to aspects of its meta.
Yep.
So, because of that, there are times where you can say that my opponent has, say, normals and ultras left, and I can play this on a wild swing and say that it's good because it's just not going like the rest of their deck happens to be normals.
Right. Yeah, that could conceivably happen in a late game scenario. And if you can build up 8 gauges this character in some scenarios, building up 2 might not be. I'm sorry, building up 6 over the course of a full game into the late game might not be undoable.
This is 100% reasonable to see is one of the last 2 or 3 strikes of the game, or as the last strike of the game.
Okay, makes sense.
And because you're almost certainly going to have this in your hand anyway, because you don't want to lose it. You want to have the overload threat.
You're holding for EXs, sure. At some point, you're like, well, all right, the normal that I wanted to EX with isn't going to work anymore because they boosted something. I have a conditional checkmate, and the conditions have been met.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, you do generally want to confirm this in some way, either by knowledge or by your opponent forgetting that this card exists, or I treat this a little bit almost like I treat this is if Shield Boomerang on Shovel and Shield Knight is the card that wins 90% of interactions. This wins like 40% of the interactions.
Right.
But you can't forget about it.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And like no one in the history of Exceed has ever forgotten about Shield Boomerang. They might forget about autonomic response. That could happen.
Right. So let's swing through the boosts.
Yes.
So the 2 boosts that are on the first 2 attacks here are very similar, and I think that as much as I've said over and over again that Carl's weakness is his economy, he has no reload boosts, he has no natural resource recovery, and he wants to leverage resources in hand against his opponent. I think these boosts are both great.
Okay.
Because
despite them being expensive.
Despite them being expensive, sometimes, one, it's a great way to use these cards when these cards are no longer valuable.
Okay.
And 2, it is when you get to those late game scenarios and your opponent may be defending on an option with which to win, this can remove that option and they can't do anything about it.
Right. Okay. So these are both stronger in the late game, it sounds like, when you are hunting for a way to confirm your setup. By which I mean your position, your mix up.
I would say that.
Okay.
So the first one, investigate. 1 force, which is again very burdensome. Opponent discards a card at random. If they discard a special, they discard another card of their choice.
Okay.
And then you draw, and you're guaranteed to get something. And if you hit something really good, and again remembering back to season 2, your specials are where your transforms live. This can really pay off.
Sure. Okay.
It's almost more valuable when you get their hand size down, because you can think about what card they want to hold.
And okay, they've been. We've just talked about this, right? This wouldn't work on Carl because this is an ultra, but there's situations where somebody is holding a card the entire game to confirm it late. This disrupts that, or has the chance of disrupting it.
Right. The same token, disarming strike, advance or disarming maneuver on disarming strike. Advance to you switch sides to your opponent. They discard a card at random.
Okay.
I know what you're thinking. Well, first of all, anything that corner crosses, this is a discount because you're getting out of the corner.
You're getting out of the corner, sure.
And more importantly to that, whenever you corner cross an opponent, you're turning their cross off while turning yours on.
Yep, definitely. And you're reversing a very bad situation for you into a very good one for you. And I think what Mad when Mad said, "I know what you're thinking," I think what he was predicting I was going to say was, this is not force efficient movement, because if you played this at range 2 in order to cross up, you have ended up at range 1 despite having spent 2 force to do it from range 2. But there's a big economic upside to this that you have to be aware of. And
Yeah.
Matt is completely right. Crossing over your opponent can be very, very strong.
Yeah, it's niche, but again, I want to be in a situation where if my opponent has N cards, I want to have N+1. So
Okay.
if I can keep parity using this effect, and again, the disruption of this can't be underestimated. If you play a lot of mix-up heavy characters, you will have those moments where you start to see your opponent's defensive patterns. Maybe they start slow, go fast,
Right.
or maybe they usually rely on something first. And if you bleed an option out, sometimes you'll make people panic. Because it is worth noting, you'll boost this, you'll pass the turn. So they can always, leave or move out or boost their own effect to change the situation.
Right.
But being able to, they're like, well, at least I have this block, or at least I have this sweep. Now you don't. Sometimes people will panic. They'll do large change cards. They'll do other maneuvers that they weren't planning on. And getting that little
you're provoking a response from them.
right.
Right. Okay.
Again, this is not necessarily game changing, but if you can get the rider on this, I think it's very much worth playing.
Okay, that makes sense. And you probably wouldn't, if you were going to advance 2 without getting the rider on it, you would probably just discard 2 force somewhere else. Like, you don't need to play this boost for that. It's I guess it's the same, right? It's the same amount.
Right.
So if you are cool with discarding disarming strike in another card, you could, but it's not giving you really a benefit without the rider.
Right.
Okay.
Armor up.
Yes.
Plus 3 armor. Plus 3 armor is pretty good.
Yeah, that makes you hard to kill.
For a character who is all about trading and deltas until he is about absolutely crushing you into the ground.
Right.
This is, again, another tool that gets its power in a very matchup specific kind of way.
Right.
Like, you need to bully your way through something you can't otherwise. Just to get to your opponent that one time. This is the thing you need. And 3 armor warps a lot of defensive math.
Right.
Simple as that.
But also Swangee elbow, right?
But also Swangee elbow.
Right.
And like you said earlier, I agree. You could spend one, and spending both on this especially hurts.
Yeah.
But you want to talk about where Carl's economy is focused entirely in one card.
Headlong run. God, close up to 6 for 0 force. That's actually nuts.
Gotta go fast.
Yeah.
And you only have 2 of these, but this solves your positioning problems.
Yep.
Your opponent crossed out. They're at range. Nope. And I think this is arguably the biggest payoff to your opponent crossing out of one of your setups. They've put themselves 1 or 2 spaces away from the corner, and now you join them there.
Right.
And it's as simple as that.
Now you're threatening all of your scariest stuff. Okay.
I mean, obviously you don't want to lose to cross if you can beat it otherwise, but
at some point you're probably going to lose to cross, right? It's going to happen.
But this is your tool for recovering your positioning in one fell swoop without dropping your entire hand. This is your one free coupon out of grappler tax.
Right. Other than that, I'm sorry to interrupt the boost conversation for a second, because especially because we only have one left in the normals. But other than that, we have, I'm assuming we're taking the move action, because we have before close 2, which is cool. We don't really have much else other than diving in or assaulting in order to make up positioning during strikes. Like, we can't really do too much of that.
Right.
if we're not using headlong run and we're not using, regular old run that's not headlong on cross, are we just taking the move action a lot?
We're taking the move action a lot, and we're playing at uncomfortable ranges.
Okay.
But the big thing is basically in the same way I talked about. If someone tries to assault in from you cheeky at range 3, you can always snap it with improvised weapon.
Right.
They cannot do that to you. They cannot do that to you reliably, especially if you slam an EX.
Right. Sure.
The ability for your EX dives and your EX assaults to get in a lot more reliably is the other tool you have for subverting the usual grappler trudge across the board.
Sure, because as you said earlier, one of the big benefits of Overload is that you don't lose your other copy of the card. That could be useful for threatening a mix-up, but it could also be really useful to preserve a movement option.
Right.
Overload dive is 6 spaces of movement. That's great.
I mean, it still costs you 6 force to do that.
Right. But it's during a strike, and it's to your point about EX attacks. It might be unstoppable from what they can throw at me. I might have enough armor and power armor from my EX and character ability to get through some stuff with those.
Exactly, and that's the benefit of the nature of Overload, and this is where the UA, like I said, pays off a little bit more. Is there are times where you will have to do, again, another common Exceed Grappler thing and play the obvious attack for positioning.
Sure.
And by EXing it, you make it a lot more reliable to actually get that before movement effect going.
Right.
And to make the trade on the other end a little less bad.
Right.
But still, this boost.
Sure. And this is going to fix a lot of it. All right. And so other economic concerns we'll talk about in just a second, I'm sure. But that is on its own very simple and very, very strong.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that makes sense. Tell me about precision engineering.
This is another thing which I think is arguably a lot stronger now into a broader meta, and was a lot weaker into a very setup and boost focused, an information focused season 2.
Right. Right. Normal in hand is into reading is really scary.
Right. Now there are ways you can ensure this isn't a problem. Maybe your opponent's focuses, or in season 6 their dives are down.
Right.
Maybe it's late enough. Maybe it's early enough that you're willing to take that chance. Maybe last turn you parried focus and you feel confident they didn't just get it. Recursion is a great effect in Exceed.
Yep.
You have your limit of playing a card twice. Now you can break that rule. It does cost you a copy of Power Short, but sometimes that's exactly what you need. Now it is a normal, which is good and bad. It means you can't get that cease of desist that you wild swung back.
Right.
But you can get a cross, you can get a dive, you can get mobility tools to get back in.
I could get something for an EX attack with the Overload I have in hand.
Right. And you can get it and of course make that into a mix-up. I grabbed the assault back from my gauge. My opponent doesn't know I also have an assault in hand. The mix-up is again, that strength of Carl will be able to threaten EXs out of normal hand and deck formation.
Right.
Just in another way. Yeah, sometimes this will get you exactly the tool you need. Sometimes it will get you the tool you need that gets you killed.
Sure. Yeah, and also it's on Power Short, which is really scary. So there's a fairly narrow band where you're going to be using this, but when it is usable, it's probably just going to win if you're smart about it.
Yeah, the tempo hit is also not minor. To be able to use this effect but then have to pass the turn is not fantastic.
Right.
But and again, because of you're rarely going to be trading this for damage. You're going to be trading this for utility or effect, because you're not getting a card with more power by putting this in your gauge.
Right. Yeah, this is I mean, even with an EX attack, unless you're in Exceed mode, like EX sweep is hitting for 7. This is hitting for 7. You're already there.
Right. So you're using this when you're in a situation where either you're fighting an opponent so zonery and evasive that you're never going to catch them, and that secondary. It's so. Sorry to keep tangenting to other characters that our watchers may not have
not at all
evidence of, but one of the classic difficult things to run into is New 13, who has the ability to give themselves a bunch of bonus range whenever they set an attack. So from starting positions, one of the most common plays against that they will do is to play Grasp and be able to hit it with you at long range and then push you even further away. They're in zone or heaven.
Yep.
So some people will play Focus from starting positions just to say, I'm not losing any ground to your gimmick.
Yeah.
And then they can get spiked in return, but putting that aside, where you can use Focus to mitigate a bad setup, using Power Short to do that, that's not great. Like resisting the movement effect, but still taking the
3 damage
is really hard to justify, especially when you're spending a card. The effect better be push, yes.
Right.
But so there are matchups where Power Short is going to be a dead card.
Right.
If I'm fighting Exceeded Zangief, like the match has gotten that far, I'm a lot less comfortable playing Power Short. Given how many of his options at range 1 destroy it.
Just beat it, right. And in the New 13 one that you just mentioned, all right, I put Focus turn 1, I whiff with my Focus, that's awful. All right, well, I'll get it back later for reading with Precision Engineering. If Power Short is a dead card in this matchup, I have more access to the boost. That means whatever I just put in gauge, I have more access to deal with.
Yeah, this effect is great, and it can definitely win you games.
Okay.
The 2 big cautions of it are, 1, it's a non-trivial tempo hit, and 2, it bleeds information on a character that normally is very good at hiding it.
Right. That makes sense.
So,
okay. So that is the kit. The other questions that I had, Mad, one is about normals and stuff, because he seems like normals man. He has a lot of power in his normals because of this exceed character ability. So I'm wondering, how am I evaluating these? We've talked a lot about how strong they are as attacks with his exceed ability. We've talked a little bit about how they enable mix-ups. Does he use his normal boosts differently than any other character? Is he still crutching on light on defend occasionally? Is he parrying things? Like is this just kind of like all of your fundamentals still apply with Carl, or are you evaluating these differently?
I think that to some extent the normal valuations still apply with 2 big asterisks on it.
Okay.
2.5, I'm going to say. One is sometimes I'll value Spike a little less than I normally would, because Elbow exists.
Sure.
And because I generally want to create a multi-turn range 1 slobber knocker, my options to use Spike get a little bit less.
Right. And then defend to confirm assault sounds kind of cool.
Right, but there's also times where your assaults are speed 6.
Yeah.
You having a copy to create that, the traditional range 3, now the range 3 EX mix up, which is even worse.
Yep.
Is great. But like any to sort of tangent out of it, it's like any grappler, you love your assaults, you love your focuses. To some lesser extent, you love your crosses because you want to get in.
Right.
The boost on run for a character without a lot of economy, it saves you a lot to get in there.
Right.
But your assaults are probably your favorite child. You land, you play Overload Assault, you trade up half the time, and now you're in, and you have the momentum, and you can play your entire mix up. Yep. Your focuses are great on defense when your opponent doesn't have the luxury of breaking that range 1 armor and can't get rid of you because you focus through their grasp. And now it's your turn again. We teach them the same lesson.
Sure.
And that's sort of a very grappler focused look at it. And the other asterisk, of course, is that benefit of keeping a copy live.
Right.
Like it matters more to him than any other character to have a copy in his pocket of something, because when he sets an overload EX, he can be 25 cards into his deck. There could be 20 cards visible in the discard pile, and it's still a mix-up.
Right.
And that the power of that cannot be underestimated. And it is a important phantom part of his power budget.
Okay.
So there's benefit to holding on to one copy of things. Of course, it also makes it a little harder to read, because I tend to find when characters have bad economy, they tend to go deeper into their decks.
Right.
Because they want to squeeze out the value from seeing all their ultras and seeing all of their options, which makes them more likely to get hit with reading. Right. So for him to be able to at least somewhat mitigate it and be like, if you're doing a guess, like a Hail Mary kind of reading, you still have got to hit multiple options. There's merit to that, but those are both secondary to punch person in face.
Yep. And various ways to enable punch person in face even harder.
Right. Like everything I've said is secondary to hit him, especially when I get to, because if I hit him, and this is somewhat similar to the beheaded game plan, I hit him, I get power. Now that I power, I hit him harder. Eventually, and then they fall over and I win.
And you won. Right. You did it.
It's as simple as that.
Yeah. Asterisk, it's as difficult as that.
Right.
Right.
Because your opponent knows that's exactly what you want to do.
Sure.
But you're willing to trade.
And you have a bad economy, so you're gonna struggle with your own deck and your own positioning in order to do it.
Right.
Okay.
You're waiting for your chances to start your offense, and once you do, you want to get your opponent in your robot vice grip and just hold on to it till they stop moving.
Yep, makes sense. So, really quick, as a kind of like final strategic consideration before we talk a little bit about counterplay and how to stop this guy, I want to know a little bit more about how to manage his economy. We've talked quite a bit about ways to sneak movement in with EX normals. We've talked about ways to recur important utility options with precision engineering. We have headlong run, obviously. In terms of managing your card flow, do you occasionally have to change cards with your ultras? Like how are you making economic decisions to make sure that you have the cards in hand that you need?
I think, and this is painful to say, but sometimes your decisions have to be reactive. Okay. If your setups aren't working, and you're Carl can very easily come back from behind if he gets across the line. If he gets into his exceed mode, he can easily win cleanly multiple strikes in a row.
Right.
And that's a capability some characters simply don't have. But sometimes you're going to have to look at the board state, and that also will mean sometimes if I have 5 cards in hand and my opponent just flung themselves to the other side of the board, and one of them is headlong run, I need to look at their kit and look at because their attitude is not going to change. There's no point at which they're going to be like, it's time for me to attack you from range 1.
Right,
if they've started running from you, they're going to keep running for you. All right, maybe Jeanette, but that's a very niche case.
Yeah, there's not a lot of characters who decide to not be zoners or like Axel sometimes does, I guess, but like these are important mode shifts that you'll know when it happens, right? It's not something that a character is just going to decide like New 13 is going to brawl today.
Yeah, and so once your opponent committed to this idea of running from you, if they've got another, leave, another fly up, another holy wings, another boost that takes them wherever they want in their pocket, then you may want to save your resources. You may want to feint your way to range. Like, you are trying to cut corners. It doesn't mean, it means going to range 1 is great. But maybe go to range 3. Maybe even go to range 4 if you have a dive live.
Oh, sure. Threaten the ability to move in as part of your mix-up too. So, control the mid-board, keep them in the corner, that kind of thing.
And that's it. Obviously, you'd love to be initiating from range 1 and threatening disgusting things like power short.
Right.
But there, you can go to range 4, and your opponent may be like, I'll dive in on them, and you play your power short then because you're a genius. But more likely than not, you're going to get that extra movement in mid strike.
Right. And we've been talking this whole time about how scary Carl is at range 1, but like nothing on any of his cards say range 1 +2 power or something like that. He doesn't have Zangief's ability. It's just that he has good cards there. He's got normals. He's got good cards almost everywhere out to range 4. So you don't like the positioning requirements are actually not as tight as I've been imagining this whole time.
They're not. And this is like this is definitely my personal play style. I think you can definitely have a lot of success focusing more on a wild sling line with him once you just kind of power him to exceed mode and just use your boost to always be in a good place.
Right.
Spend your force otherwise. But his boost kit doesn't have a lot of stats in it. We've got Swangee for stats, armor. And that's it.
Yeah. Right.
His everything else is utility or card pressure. He wants to use the quality of those cards to beat you down, but he also wants to use the threat of overload to compel you to burn options.
Right.
So it's like I said at the beginning, I personally believe you've got to win from
your hand. Right. Okay, that makes sense. So
yeah, go ahead.
Oh yeah, my final question was actually about we've sort of established the win condition, we've established how to get there. How does my opponent stop him? What is what is the Swangee counterplay?
Figure out what your checks are, where you can hit breakpoints on him. That there are a lot of times you may reflexively play something because you think it'll work and it doesn't.
Right.
Either because he EX'd out of nowhere or that one armor kicked in. I'll just push him out of the way with this special. Oh no, he's still here.
Yeah, he's power shorting or he's focusing or something.
Right.
Okay.
And so you've got to know, take a quick look over his breakpoints versus yours, do some math, and be aware of when something doesn't really work. You want to exploit that bad economy. Take move actions if you've got to. If you've got things that let you reposition and take another action. I think, frankly, our trading dummy Ryu is one of the harder matchups for Carl. Because he's got reversal stats from unique positions, which threaten Carl's overloads. He's got
2 and 4. He can actually box with some EX attacks and actually be threatening at them.
Mm-hmm. He's got ignore armor on demand.
Yep.
He's got great stats. He's got free movement, and he can definitely put a great deal of pressure on Carl's positioning demand attacks.
Right. So if your character has any of those things, Ryu has all of them. But if your character has any of those things, you might be able to leverage them against Carl and find some success. It sounds like.
Yeah, I think characters that have strong action compression do well against Carl. Because in a season where a lot of people did, he didn't.
Right.
Characters that have things like preemptive strike, +2 speed, now strike.
Right.
Plus power, now strike. That can turn the math back on him. +2 is a very important breakpoint because EX only gets you 1.
Right.
And
so those characters can still be in control of the mix-up, even though you can defensively EX and mess with all sorts of math.
Right.
Okay.
He can beat +1. He cannot beat +2.
That makes sense.
And play from your favorite ranges instead of his. If you're gonna fight him at range 1, be very confident in your options. And if you've got things like range 1 dodges that you can, turn the mix-up around on him with, that's very effective. But he is a stat monster. He's got numbers out the robot ears. And especially once he flips, he just starts having a lot of absolute win interactions that you have to be able to face.
Right.
And that's, it can be overwhelming. But keep calm.
Yep.
He
Either beat him before that or have a plan when he does flip.
Yeah, if you can just, because again, for all of his ability to threaten these powerful EX reversals, if you have something that just works,
Right.
To trade out those last little bits of life, especially powerful ultras is also where it works there, because you clip that little bit of extra armor out and can secure a win out of somewhere you otherwise might not be able to.
Right.
The other thing I think he's somewhat vulnerable to, though that's rarer, is speed dodges.
Oh, sure. I was
Because
actually going to ask you, Matt, about how he would perform into more modern seasons. And speaking of speed dodges, season 6 has those all over the place. So
yeah, I think
he might be a little bit scared of those.
yeah, it would definitely be frustrating because a lot of those will be there's a lot of speed dodges that are like 5 or lower, and just turning assault off for
Right.
him
Right.
is very difficult for him to deal with. And turning both off assault and EX dive, especially since all the dodges in that season aren't printed speed.
Yeah, they're speed, right? Yeah,
Yeah,
because they're for dealing with setups, and he would tip himself over that threshold.
yeah. For against those characters, he's got to play very differently,
Right.
because a lot of them on offense they have the action compression, and on defense they have these silver bullets that beat even his very strong EX offense.
Right.
So I haven't played a lot of that, but I imagine it's not a great time. In the same way, season 7 having a lot of action compression built into their kits, even just on the normal boosts with the power of cancel, I think
Right.
would give him a hard time. But you can never count out +2 power on normals.
And also, I mean, like one of the things that you told me off the air before we started is the metagame that he was in. He was a stat monster in a world where end games were, overwhelmingly terrifying. He was a stat monster into season 3 when everyone was a stat monster. Characters kind of aren't as much of stat monsters these days. Boosts tend to be slightly lower in payout. You tend to get characters who have a lot more action compression and a lot less like I just hit you once for a zillion damage. Do you think he could compete into a more modern metagame if you just sort of time warped him up?
That's a really interesting question. And I'm not just saying that because I'm stalling for time. I think, like I said, I think it's hard to count out the interaction warping power of +2 power on normals, especially on someone who can produce as many EXs as he can.
Right.
I think I think it would be a very interesting question to see if his poor economy can keep up with the cheap or free movement that a lot of other seasons can generate.
Right.
And I think if you were playing him into modern seasons, you'd be a lot more looking for defensive EXs to turn the tables.
Okay. That
And
makes
then
sense.
hope to win a few big interactions. And I think honestly, you might see his ultras used more, because you might be looking to win a strike that authoritatively in order to ensure that you could hold the game.
That you're keeping up. That makes sense. Okay, cool. So he has a chance if somebody's holding a legacy tournament, maybe bring him in as a stats pick. Cool.
If you're bringing him into a legacy tournament, I would also say I personally love his gameplay, and I think there is a lot of nuance to him.
Mm-hmm.
But this is not nearly as complicated as some of the math on. You're putting the math pressure on your opponent. So
right.
If it's an all-day, like long set tournament, I would say there's merit in bringing him as a lower intensity pick for your brain.
Oh, sure. Yeah, he's your like safety valve for when you are cooking your brain trying to play 9 or Arakune or Jacko or somebody. Sometimes you're like, all right, I did that. Now I just want to hit someone really, really hard for my sanity and for my game plan. I need to take a little bit of pressure off my brain.
I have just played 55 turns of Minato. I'm gonna play this guy now.
I'm gonna play Swangee. The game's gonna end in 7 turns one way or another. I'm either gonna die or my opponent is.
But yeah, he's great fun. I also think he makes a great introductory character, despite the uniqueness of his mechanic. I think it's his mechanics, his character is very kind of easy to process, and I think he's a great time. I think everyone should give him a try. I think he's, if you put him in the Exceed yearbook next to Clover, he is the cooler Carl.
No question. Yeah.
And
I mean, you put it this way, listeners at home, and maybe this is where we'll leave it because I love this character. MadFnorder, Exceed expert, veteran of the game, Gearface, idiot. Both of these people love Carl Swangee. New player who is still learning the ropes and still feels like he has a long way to go before he can actually say anything authoritatively about Exceed, loves Carl. Mad, who has been in here for a long time and knows exactly what he's doing, loves Carl. There's a lot of good reasons to love this character, I think.
Yeah, just go out there and show people that they shouldn't mess with you, and that a physical confrontation would be profoundly unwise.
Profoundly unwise, Mad. All right. Matt, that was great. Thank you so much. Really, really enjoyed talking to you about this guy. Anything else you want to add before we wrap it up?
No, I mean, I don't have any particular shout outs to give, but thank you so much for having me on. I'm really, this character, like I said, I played him through a lot of the earlier tournament sagas with where Exceed still had major organized events, and I think of him really fondly. He's a good robot. Does punches people in the face and solves problems for you.
Absolutely. Well, Mad, thank you so much. Always a pleasure having you on the show. Been a blast talking to you. Audience watching at home, thank you so much for your time and your attention. I will see you all for the next one. Goodbye, everybody.